computer. Perfect. Okay, so when we are looking at decreases, again, they are directional. So a knit two together leans to the right, and to do a knit two together, we're going to come into the second stitch on the left-hand needle, and we're going to pop through both stitches at the same time. Okay, so I've got two stitches right there. I'm going to come to the left of the second stitch and go into both stitches and come through and bring that strand through both of them. And if you look, you can kind of see both of those stitches, both of those loops hanging out. Okay, and because you guys are teachers, I know that a little extra information sometimes is helpful. The reason a knit two together leans to the right is because we are taking that left stitch and putting it on top of the right stitch. So I'm going to show you a knit two together again real quick. I'm going to go into the second stitch on the needle, go through both of those stitches, right? So go in from the second one, go through both stitches, and bring my yarn through both of them. And that gives me a knit two together. And that leans to the right. If I wanted a stitch to lean to the left, I would actually try to take this right hand stitch and put it on top of the left hand. So Barbara, to answer your question, I'm going to show this to you, but you don't need to worry about the stitch for this hat. It's called a slip knit. So I'm going to slip a stitch, insert the needle into the front, and I'm going to just knit those two together. And that causes the stitch that was on the right side to sit on top of the left, and so it leans to the left. So for our hat, the only decrease that we're going to do on this hat is actually a knit two together. So once you've knit 25 stitches, you would knit two together, then knit 49 stitches, knit two together, and knit 24. By the time you're done with this round, you should have 100 stitches.
Okay.
I'm going to take out those little
we lost
increases that I did.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If you are trying to figure out whether or not you've completed a decrease, first of all, when you feel it, that you'll feel smooth, 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 and you'll feel a bump. And I've actually taught several blind people knitting techniques, and they are better at knowing where these decreases are than I swear anyone else, because they just feel along and they feel that. What it looks like is I have a column that comes up and a column that comes up, and those two columns become one. And if I pull down, I can see my two loops. So if you get lost, that's your easiest way to figure out whether or not you have done those decreases. So I'm going to stop the recording for just a second, and okay, so I've made it over where I need to be. So I'm going to just go ahead and knit two together again. So I'm going to come into the second stitch that's on the needle, and I'm going to go through both stitches, right? And if you'll look, I will say this is one of my little tricks. See how I'm getting down toward the tip of the needle where it's a little skinnier? If I put the index finger of my left finger on the back of those stitches, they're not going to slide off, and then I can easily pop into that. You'll notice when I wrap my my knit, right, my back needle for knitting, see how both of my needles are still down toward the tip? So I'm coming around and then I come through both. At this point, I push that needle all the way up onto the full size of that needle and push those stitches off. The reason I do it that way is that makes your decrease smaller. It makes it easier to get into those stitches. It makes the actual decrease itself not get stretched out and weird. And it's a really lovely sort of look. So let me show that to you again. You're smooshing down to the end. You're going ahead and knitting those two stitches together, right, and out. And it just looks really nice. And so your goal is to not have these decrease stitches that look huge where your normal knit stitches are small. And if you would like to see what it looks like to take out those stitches if you did them by accident, you'll turn your work, you'll tension your yarn, and you can actually just pull into
Move it up a little
those stitches. Oops, sorry.
Thank you. There.
Thank you. Right there. Pull right into those stitches, going backwards, right? So towards you. So both of my stitches are right there. Boy, sometimes those cameras do not want to There. And then I turn my work again facing me. I was also telling Carol I'm going to do a little demonstration on how to fix mistakes on Friday. It's a free class, so if anybody wants to pop into that, feel free. I think it's at noon, but it's on our calendar. And it's just something to watch. And even if it's ahead of where you think you are, it helps explain the knit stitch, so it's a little easier to understand it. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to get all the way down to the end of my round. And if I look at the pattern, the end of round 1, we just finished knitting, right? And then round 2, we're going to knit 10 and place markers. So I'm going to pause the video. And okay, so in your packages, you guys received stitch markers that were white and stitch markers that had some color. You have a color stitch marker that is your beginning and end of round. I have really pretty ones because I like really pretty things in my knitting. So this is my beginning and end of round, this little acorn, right? And I'm now going to knit 10 stitches and I will place a marker. So the most important thing is as I knit those, as I get to whatever marker I'm going to be placing, that marker looks different than my beginning and end of round marker. 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, and 10. So I have these little guys here. Whenever you're ready for pretty markers, we have Linda who makes them, and she always makes these really, really pretty things, and they make me happy. But it's, I do tell people when they first start out to use markers that are really plain and simple. So that's my number 10, 10 stitches, and I've placed that marker, and I'm gonna keep knitting. So I'm gonna follow that all the way around. I will count 10 and place a marker. By the way, in your ribbing, if you're really struggling with it, you can actually, place a marker every 5, 10, whatever, 15 rounds. And that helps you make sure, not rounds, I'm sorry, stitches. And that would help you make sure that you're staying in pattern and not have to go all the way back to figure out where the pattern messed up. 4, 6, 8,
That's
10.
what I have mine marked every 25 stitches.
Perfect.
Because I was making sure that I got 102 stitches on. And so every time I hit that, I say, okay, where should I be in my 3-stitch pattern?
Absolutely.
To check.
And if you 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and you'll notice that I count in my head and then I go ahead and recount before I put a marker on. But if you, Barbara, if you actually say, okay, instead of keeping it at 25 stitches, if I put it at either 26 or 27, but at a purl, then you'll know when you get to that marker that the stitch right before the marker ought to be a purl. And so if it's not a purl, you'll actually immediately know that something went wrong within those 25 stitches.
Right, right. I didn't, when I started with the 25 sets of 25s, I didn't have a clue what we were about to do.
Sure, absolutely.
Now I
so
would do some division of 3.
Yes. When we do lace knitting, I think of what I have with me. We mark the lace repeats, right? So that it's easy. So if you make a mistake, it's usually they're like 12 or 15 stitches, but they're complicated. You're doing all kinds of stuff. You're constantly changing. And so it's kind of a cool, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 thing to be able to take a step back and say, okay, my mistake in this 300 some odd stitches is going to be right in these 12.
Yes.
But then you have to figure out how to fix it.
Well, yes.
Or you bring it to me. And I do teach lots of fixing mistakes classes because I firmly believe in your need to be independent, but I also am happy to fix stuff for people. I do it all the time. And I can reach down and fix just about anything.
Last night when it was at midnight, and I'm like, yeah, I can't wait.
Yeah. At midnight, you're on your own. You're not going to have enough stitches.
Yeah, I think once I learn how to backtrack and how to fix, I will be in better shape. Because I don't see myself getting consistent enough, fast enough.
Yeah, that is truly what that the demonstration is on Friday. I can't recommend it enough. It's actually my favorite thing to teach, because I hate it when I don't know how to do something, can't fix something, and have to tear it out. It's so frustrating. Let me grab a few more stitch markers.
Oh, well, that's good. This is at noon on Friday?
I think it's at noon on Friday. And
Good.
it's just, I think it'll be maybe an hour and a half.
Good. Because I have another meeting at 1:30. So
Perfect. I do feel like I spend a lot of time on, I'm making a different size, you guys. But that's okay. This will work. I spend a lot of time on Zoom anymore, right? It's amazing.
Yeah.
Have they figured out for you guys yet in the fall if you're going to be live?
We're going to be
Not
a
yet.
combination. So I
Combination.
think I've mostly worked out mostly hybrid for mine, so I'll mostly be online. Just have to tweak a little bit of the labs and stuff. So
yes,
Gotcha.
I will be online for lecture, but I can't be online for lab.
No, because you don't really want to send chemistry things home with people.
Well,
You
yeah,
can be like a candy, right?
yeah,
good, but I'm one half of a set. There are two people who teach my course, and so we each teach a lecture section, but then we have 6 sections of lab, so smaller number of people, and they're all mixed up, and so what we have to agree together what we're going to do, and since we have
Gotcha.
extraordinarily different personalities, it's always interesting.
It can be tough, huh? Okay, so I am just going to show you real quick where we are. So your next step is on round number 3, you're going to knit 2 stitches from the marker, which means 2 stitches before the marker, and you will knit 2 together and then slip your marker, and you'll repeat that to the end. So if you look at your pattern, anything that is in parentheses is your repeat. It's a little bit like math, and you'd always do what's in those parentheses first. This is pretty straightforward. So you're going to knit 2 stitches before the marker, knit 2 together, and slip your marker. So this is me having knitted to 2 stitches before my marker. I'm now going to knit those 2 stitches together.
When it says here, it says knit 2 stitches from marker, I would have interpreted that as from marker being on the other side of the marker, past the marker.
I know. It's a knitting language, and 2 stitches from marker is how it's said. So that's
It's
one of the reasons to learn. Yeah.
So it's right now, right here where you are. It's basically so you've just been knitting and there's 2 right in front of the marker. So those are the 2 that you're going to double stitch or whatever that's called.
Knit together.
Knit together. That's what it is. Okay.
Yes.
And then you carry on.
Then you slip that marker. Do not take your markers off.
Okay.
I've seen people do sometimes. Those markers stay on until you're all the way at the very, very end. Right? So I'm going to continue with my knitting. Oops. Sorry. I'm definitely not as fast at the throwing. Until I get to 2 stitches before my marker. And again, I'm going to pop into those 2 stitches. Always easiest if I have them down at the end. Bring through both. There's my marker, and I just slip my marker from one needle to the other. You can take it off and move it, but you literally just pop it right onto the needle and get it out of your way.
It never gets it just gets slid around the top.
It just gets slid right from one needle to the other. If you ever, there are funny, not so funny, but funny occasions where we've all like knit our markers into our work, you know,
Yeah,
it's super annoying.
that'd be problematic.
Yeah, it's particularly annoying when it's a metal marker because you can't just like cut it and get it out. You have to literally have to rip your work to take it out. So try not to do that. Okay, so once you have gone all the way around and knit the 2 stitches together before each of those markers, that means you're for each of those little segments that had 10 stitches before, now you have 9 stitches. If you are a counter, you can take the time then to count each little section. But in knitting, at least for the first few rounds of these decreases, you have a what's called a relief row. You have just a plain knit row in between, and that tends to be where I choose to do my counting because I'm pretty good at reaching down and fixing a mistake. So you could do it in either place, but you do want to make sure that at some point you're counting to make sure you truly are doing a decrease between each one of them. Because if for some reason you are forgetting and you're consistently forgetting in the same spot, you can end up with like a crazy lopsided hat, and no good comes from that.
Exactly, it's the lopsided.
Yeah.
That would be fashionable.
Okay, and what I'm going to do, since I've realized that this is a hat I'd started a while ago and thought, oh my gosh, I have the chance to actually finish this, but I'm making a different size. So my having done that decrease in the middle, I should have recounted and remembered what I was working on. But since I've done that anyway, what I'm going to do is on this next round, I'm going to show you how to switch to the DPNs. So I'm going to stop the video for just a little bit. Hold on, I have to start the recording again. Okay, so I've just started by knitting, getting my needle out of the way. So I just usually pull it down out of the way a little bit and poke it into my fabric so that it's out of my way and I don't have to worry about it. I've just started to knit my stitches onto the double pointed needle, and you can see that the double pointed needle is shorter. So I can't accommodate all of the stitches on it. So I'm going to knit the first 3 sections on it. So I'm not going to worry about markers at the ends, right? I'm only going to worry about markers in the middle. So I've just knitted my 9 and knitted 2 together. I guess 7 and knitted 2 together. And now I'm going to knit to 2 stitches before the marker again.
Does it ever happen that people end up having the stitches fall off the other end?
Yes. So typically when I switch to double pointed needles, I'm doing it earlier with you guys than I ever do. I normally make sure that I'm normally down to maybe 6 or 7 stitches between the markers before I switch. And because you really do, and I've given you longer needles than what I'm working with to help ensure that it doesn't happen. Okay, so here's what I want you to see. This is 3 sections, right? This is 1 and 2 and 3. We assume the existence of markers at the beginning and end of the double pointed needles. So this next marker right here, I'm going to go ahead and take that off because I don't need it anymore. If I have it at the end, it's just going to fall off and it's going to be annoying and freaky. So you assume there would be a marker here, right, at the beginning, and this is one section. These markers mark my middle section, and this marker marks my next section, and then I would assume that there's a marker here. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes. Now when it says, it's just saying change to DPNSs when needed. How the hell
Yes.
do we know when needed is?
That's such a great question, Barbara. You will know when they're needed when you can no longer fit all of your stitches around on that circular needle, because as you're doing decreases, the circumference of your hat is getting smaller and your needle is 16 inches around. And so at some point, your stitches are going to get really spread out and they'll look like that. And you can't get them any closer in because your needle itself is pulling those stitches all the way out. Typically for me, I don't like to change to double pointed needles until I have to. So typically, so right now I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 stitches between my markers. When I normally make this change is when I'm about 6 or 7 stitches between those markers. Okay. The reason I'm doing it earlier for you guys is so you don't have to sit and watch me knit for an hour. Okay, so I'm just going to, again, knit all the way to 2 stitches before that marker. And I will knit 2 together again. Okay, and I've got 2, so I'm going to put 1 more, and this is my middle section, so this is the one that I'm actually going to have 4 sections on. And I typically do the middle needle with the one with more of them because it makes sense to me. It doesn't really matter. You can do it on any one of them. It doesn't matter at all.
So you're going to have a whole lot of needles stuck in various places in that work.
We sure are. And it looks a little like a voodoo doll for a moment. For sure. 1, 2, 3. Just don't have mean thoughts about me with it. But it takes, so double pointed needles are used to close or work any circumference of knitting that is smaller than the needles would allow, right? So again, we are working with circular needles that are 16-inch. So once we go from about a 22-inch circumference on our hat to below 16-inch, our needles would pull those stitches apart. And so we're needing something that allows us to get all the way to where we can close it. This is my extra little stitch marker, so I'm going to move that over. And I've got 1, 2, 3, and 4 sections. And so that, and I can see I've got my first needle on there and my second needle on there. And now I'm going to go ahead and knit the last one little section on.
So is there any other times when you use those double-headed needles other than when you're going from in the round to not in the round? Well, I guess you're going
We're
in the
remaining
round
in the round for sure. And the reason that we're using it is because we are trying to close entirely the top of the hat, right? It doesn't have an opening. And so we're going from a tiny or from a nice large opening to no opening at all. And that is, that's our goal. So that's why we're using them. Yes, you use them when you make a sweater and you knit down to a cuff. You use them when you make socks. I also use them as cable needles when I create cables. So they are used quite often. There are other techniques that you can use where you don't have to have a double pointed needle. But it's not, that's called magic loop. It's just a whole different story and I don't want to bug you with that.
I saw one of those videos this morning, like, what the heck? Oh,
yeah.
Late last night. I'm like, okay, I can't. Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually really cool. And I'm teaching, the class I taught yesterday was how to make a very basic sock on with magic loop. Okay, so my needle can come out all together. So now I have, find my last needle. Now I have all of my stitches on these 3 needles, okay? I have my stitch markers still hanging out, right? Marking the spots where I'm going to do my decrease. And that is correct of everywhere, except remember at the very end, I'm going to assume that there's a stitch marker right there. So as I'm doing this, best practice is the needle that you're going to be working with should sit on top of the other needles. So see how it's up on top? And I'm going to then come in and work across. I'm working 2 decrease rows on top of each other just to show you. I'm sorry, guys, let me switch my knitting. That is such a habit.
Oh, so now you're knitting a total onto a totally different
So I have
needle.
a free needle, right, that had nothing on it.
Yeah.
So I have three needles with stitches on it and one free needle. So now I'm getting to my little decrease. I'm going to knit my decrease, slip my marker, knit all the way to that next marker, and do my decrease, slip my marker, and now I'm on the last little section, right? And so here's where I'm going to have to say to myself, please remember, self, that at the very end of this needle, even though there isn't a marker, at the end of any needle, that is where a marker would exist. And so I'm going to knit two together. Can I tell you one more thing? Sorry, this is pretty important. When you very first start, right? This is the first needle that we just knit onto. So trying to unlock a locking marker. This is where you switch from the beginning and end of round. So this is where you switch from beginning to end of round. So I'd like to go ahead and place a marker right before I start working on my DPNs to remind myself that's the beginning and end. It doesn't really matter if you're counting, you will always know exactly where you are. So once I finish one of these, oops, sorry, let's find out where my yarn is. That was the beginning. Okay, so my yarn's over here. So this is the needle I just finished. And since my yarn's here, right, and I'm going to work on the next needle, I know my beginning and end of round was right at this initial change. So once I knit all the stitches onto a new needle, that frees up my other needle. So that means I'm going to turn my work to that next needle. I'm going to put that needle on top of the others, and I'm going to use my newly freed up needle to knit. Okay, Barbara, I think you're asking me a question that I ignored you.
That's okay. I realized that it was too complicated. So can't imagine doing all of this blind. But so the marker you just put in, that was, I think, the marker of that was the beginning.
Yes.
Isn't that the same place where your marker, or close to the same place as the marker that began the whole piece?
It's exactly where that marker would be. But remember, I had that really pretty marker as my beginning and end of round marker, but I don't have markers at the beginning and end of my needles. So this little guy would normally have been sitting like that. But because I don't have anything else on this needle, the moment I dip that needle, that marker comes off. Make sense? So yes. It's really more a matter of right as you start, once you switch to those double pointed needles, and you know this, assuming like this is your first one, and you know that marker is no longer there. If you take one of the locking markers that you have and just put it on that fabric, that tells you that's where that break happens. The other way you will know is counting your number of stitches, because if you're on a decrease round, then each time you work a little section, you have fewer stitches, right? And so you'll know exactly where you are. Because as I started this with 2, 4, 6, 8, now as I do that decrease, I only have 7.
You're assuming that we're always going to be correct. That is a silly assumption.
I have great faith in you. Right? And so you just keep going. Okay, so that's basically all there is to it. And you do that all the way until you have just a few stitches left. And what I will do is add a little video at the end of this to show you how to close the top of the hat. because it's pretty simple, but it sounds a little weird. You're simply just going to cut your yarn and thread it through all of those stitches. But the most important thing for you to get in this is how to work with those DP ends and how to do that knit two together. And it'll be a little while before
Yeah.
you need to worry about closing the top of your hat.
So I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So I like the pattern that's on the inside, so I'd rather have that be on the outside. So when I close it, is there a certain way that I need to do it?
You're going to follow exactly the same instructions because I think you are actually knitting your hat inside out. I don't want to confuse you and I don't want you to change, because if you change, you'll change the fabric. But if you look up here real fast, I'll tell you what I mean. When we knit, the fabric that faces us should be the public side. And if you look, I'm knitting close to me, right? So my yarn is here and I'm knitting these stitches right here.
Yeah.
I would imagine, Marnie, what you're doing is knitting the stitches that are away from you.
Well, when I showed you
and
the
not
pattern,
close to you.
when I showed you the pattern, I had flipped the hat inside out.
Oh, okay. Then yeah, you're knitting perfectly. So, so yeah, just keep doing exactly what you're doing, but knit it with the right side still facing you. And then you'll just wear it inside out.
Okay, but it won't mess up the top like the way we're closing it?
Nope. Nope. It'll look exactly the same. And all we're going to do is your very last step of pulling the stitches off the needle. We're going to do it just slightly differently. Right. It's really you're weaving in your ends. You want to weave in your ends on the right side instead of the wrong side.
Yeah. Okay.